There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got or how hard you worked physically. It shows up after spending time with certain people. An hour of conversation that leaves you feeling hollowed out. A lunch meeting where you were fully present and engaged but walked away feeling like something essential was extracted without your permission. Not your time exactly, not your attention in the conventional sense. Something deeper and more difficult to name. Your capacity to feel centered in your own experience, to access your own thoughts without static, to inhabit your body without the sensation of being colonized by someone else's emotional weather. And here's the part that makes this phenomenon particularly difficult to address. The person who just drained you often has no conscious awareness they did it. They're not operating with explicit malicious intent. They're not consciously aware they're functioning as though other people exist primarily as resources for their emotional regulation, their validation needs, their constant requirement for attention or drama or problem solving that never actually resolves anything. They just know, on some instinctive level, that being around you makes them feel better, more stable, less alone with their internal chaos. And you, if you're the type of person this keeps happening to, have probably been taught from early childhood that making other people feel better is not just kind but morally obligatory, that boundaries are inherently selfish, that your own discomfort is less important than someone else's expressed need. Which means you keep showing up, keep giving, keep trying to help or fix or soothe, and keep walking away depleted in ways you can't quite articulate to others or even to yourself, but definitely feel in your body and your diminished capacity to engage with your own life. The pattern repeats with eerie consistency across contexts once you start recognizing it. At work, there's the colleague who always has a crisis, who needs just a few minutes of your time that inevitably stretch into an hour or more, who leaves their emotional chaos scattered across your desk like toxic debris and walks away lighter while you sit there with the residue, trying unsuccessfully to refocus on your own tasks while your nervous system processes what just happened. In friendships, there's the person who calls only when they're in distress, who dominates every conversation with their problems presented in exhaustive detail, who never asks how you are except as a perfunctory transition before redirecting the conversation immediately back to themselves and their struggles. In family systems, there's the relative who requires constant emotional management, whose moods dictate the emotional weather of every gathering, who punishes any attempted boundaries with guilt or coldness or direct accusations that you don't care about them, that you're selfish, that you've changed and not for the better. What all these interactions have in common beneath their surface differences is fundamental asymmetry. The exchange is structurally one-directional. Energy, attention, patience, emotional labor, care, all of it flowing consistently toward one person who absorbs without reciprocating, who takes without awareness that taking is happening, who experiences other people as extensions of their own psychological needs rather than as separate beings with interior lives equally deserving of consideration and protection. And the person on the receiving end of this dynamic often struggles to name what's happening with any clarity because the behavior doesn't fit the cultural scripts we have for obvious abuse or toxicity. The energy vampire isn't always yelling or insulting or overtly controlling. Often they're charming, needy, apparently helpless, visibly wounded, presenting as fragile. They're suffering genuinely, and they need help constantly. And somehow it's never enough, and the helping never ends. And you start to feel like you're failing at being a decent person because you can't fix them, can't make them okay, can't give enough to fill what feels like a bottomless void. The psychological mechanism operating here involves something considerably more complex than simple selfishness or lack of consideration. People who function as energy vampires in relationships are often operating from deep attachment wounds and profoundly underdeveloped capacity for emotional self-regulation. They didn't learn, during critical developmental windows in early childhood, how to soothe themselves, how to tolerate discomfort without immediately seeking external relief, how to be alone with their own emotional states without reflexively seeking another person to regulate what they can't manage internally. When a child's distress is consistently met with adequate attunement, when the caregiver accurately reflects the child's emotional state, soothes effectively, and helps the child gradually move through difficult emotions toward resolution, the child slowly internalize those regulatory capacities over time. They develop an inner resource, an internal structure, a capacity to hold themselves through hard moments without fragmenting or needing constant external intervention. When that developmental attunement is absent, inconsistent, or actively harmful, the child grows into an adult who still needs external regulation for emotional states they never learned to manage autonomously. They need other people to perform the psychological function they never developed internally. This isn't necessarily conscious manipulation, though it certainly can become that over time with enough repetition and reward. Initially, it's developmental arrest. The person literally doesn't have the internal structure required to manage their own emotional states effectively, so they compulsively seek others to do it for them. And because the need is essentially bottomless, because no amount of external soothing can permanently substitute for the internal capacity they lack, they become what looks and feels vampiric in their impact. They drain whoever is willing to give, and when that person is finally depleted and withdrawn, they move on to the next available source without genuine awareness that they're repeating a destructive pattern. What makes certain people particularly vulnerable to being consistently drained by these dynamics is often the mirror image of the exact same developmental issue, just manifesting differently. If the energy vampire didn't develop adequate self-regulation, the person who keeps getting drained often didn't develop healthy self-protection or appropriate self-prioritization. They learned early, usually through some combination of modeling and direct conditioning, that their value as a human being comes from usefulness, from caretaking, from prioritizing others' needs and feelings over their own. Maybe they grew up with a parent who was emotionally unavailable, volatile, addicted, or narcissistic, and the child learned to become hypervigilant, to manage the parent's moods proactively, to make themselves small and endlessly accommodating to avoid conflict or threatened abandonment. That adaptation, genuinely helpful and perhaps necessary for survival in childhood, becomes a profound vulnerability in adult relationships. The person now unconsciously signals availability to be used. They have difficulty saying no without enormous guilt. They feel selfish and cruel setting even minimal boundaries. They automatically interpret someone else's distress as their personal responsibility to fix, regardless of whether that's realistic or welcome. And energy vampires, operating primarily on unconscious survival instinct rather than conscious strategy, can sense this availability with uncanny accuracy. Not through deliberate malice, but through the same kind of attunement that predators have for vulnerable prey. They're scanning their environment for someone who will absorb what they need to expel, and they reliably find the people whose entire psychological structure is organized around giving, even when it costs them everything. The reason this dynamic is so profoundly difficult to interrupt once it's established is that it's often completely invisible to both parties involved. The vampire doesn't consciously think they're taking too much because they experience their needs as genuinely urgent and legitimate, which on some level they often are. The distress is real, the need for support is real. What's missing is awareness of proportion, reciprocity, impact. The person being drained doesn't think they're giving too much because they've deeply internalized the cultural belief that this is just what caring looks like, that good people don't measure or limit what they give, that boundaries are fundamentally unkind or indicate a failure of love. And the broader culture, especially in its messages directed at women, caregivers, and people in helping professions, actively reinforces this extractive dynamic. The message absorbed from 1,000 sources is that selflessness equals virtue, that accommodating others equals emotional maturity, that if you're feeling drained or resentful, it's because you need better self-care routines or a more positive attitude, not because the relationship itself is structurally extractive and fundamentally unbalanced. But self-care practices, Baths, meditation, exercise, journaling, whatever the wellness industry is currently selling, cannot compensate for relationships that are fundamentally parasitic in their structure. It's like trying to fill a bucket that has a substantial hole in the bottom. You can pour in as much restorative activity as you want, but if the relationship is actively draining you at a rate faster than you can replenish, you'll never stabilize. The intervention has to happen at the level of the relationship itself, which means boundaries, which means tolerating the profound discomfort of disappointing someone or being perceived as selfish, unkind, or insufficiently loving. Recognizing energy vampires in your life requires developing the capacity to pay sustained attention to how you actually feel during and after interactions, not how you think you should feel or how the other person tells you that you feel. The diagnostic criteria isn't necessarily what the person says or does in any objective sense. It's your internal subjective experience of depletion. After spending time with this person, do you feel lighter or heavier? More energized or more exhausted? More connected to yourself or more fragmented and scattered? Some interactions are naturally demanding, supporting a friend through genuine acute crisis, helping someone navigate grief or loss, being present for real difficulty that requires sustained attention and care. Those can certainly be tiring, but they don't usually leave you feeling drained. This particular qualitatively different way, there's reciprocity present, even if it's not immediate or symmetrical in the moment. There's recognition and acknowledgement that you're giving something significant. There's gratitude, or at minimum, basic acknowledgement of your effort and presence. With energy vampires, none of those elements are reliably present. The interaction feels compulsory rather than chosen. Your contributions are absorbed instantly without visible acknowledgement or appreciation. If you attempt to share your own experience or perspective, it's systematically ignored, minimized, or immediately redirected back to them and their concerns. And critically, diagnostically, there's no actual progress over time. The same problems recur with predictable regularity. The same crises repeat on loop. The person never genuinely implements solutions that are offered, never takes meaningful responsibility for their patterns, never shifts or grow. They stay stuck, and they want you to stay stuck with them, endlessly processing their stuckness without ever actually moving through it toward resolution or change. The social dimension of this dynamic becomes starkly visible when you start setting boundaries and carefully notice the reactions you receive. A person who is genuinely overwhelmed and seeking help will usually respond to clearly stated boundaries with some version of understanding and respect, even if they're disappointed or would prefer more access to you. They'll adjust their expectations. They'll respect your stated limits. They might even express relief that you're being direct and honest about your actual capacity rather than pretending to have more availability than you do. Energy vampires respond in a qualitatively different way. Boundaries are experienced and treated as personal attacks. Saying no, even when done kindly and with clear explanation, triggers immediate defensiveness, guilt-tripping, accusations of abandonment or betrayal, claims that you don't actually care about them. The vampire will often escalate dramatically, create more urgent drama, manufacture more crisis, increase the emotional intensity, specifically to test whether the boundary will hold under pressure. This isn't usually conscious strategic manipulation, though it can become that. Initially, it's pure panic. The vampire has come to depend on you for essential emotional regulation, and withdrawing that availability feels to them like a genuine threat to their psychological survival. So they push, they manipulate, they deploy whatever tactics have worked historically to restore your compliance. And this is precisely where many people collapse back into the familiar pattern, because the acute discomfort of being perceived as bad or cruel or selfish is more immediately intolerable than the chronic depletion of continuing to give past your limits. But this is the exact mechanism that keeps the entire pattern locked in place. The vampire learns through operant conditioning that escalation works, that pushing hard enough will eventually restore access. And you learn that boundaries are too psychologically costly to maintain. The dynamic entrenches further with each repetition. One way to begin shifting this pattern without immediately severing all contact with these relationships is through systematically tracking your own responses and reactions in writing over time. When you notice that you feel significantly drained after an interaction, sit down as soon as possible afterward and write down what actually happened, with as much behavioral specificity as you can manage. Not the story you reflexively tell yourself about it, not "they were having a really hard time and needed my support," but the actual observable sequence of events. How long did the interaction last? How much of that time was them talking versus you? What specifically did they ask about your life? Did they genuinely listen when you answered, asking follow-up questions and tracking your responses? Or did they redirect immediately back to themselves and their concerns? What did you actually feel in your body during the conversation? Tension, fatigue, irritation, numbness, the impulse to escape? What did you want to say but didn't allow yourself to express? What specifically stopped you from saying it? This practice isn't about building a prosecutorial case against a person. It's about making visible the patterns that operate completely below conscious awareness and therefore can't be addressed. Over time, as the data accumulates, you start seeing with clarity that what's happening isn't random, isn't occasional, isn't about them having an unusually bad day or week. It's a consistent, predictable structure. And that clarity, that undeniable evidence gathered through your own direct observation, is what creates the actual possibility of meaningful change, because you fundamentally can't adjust or address what you can't clearly see and name. Another practical approach involves experimenting with implementing very small specific boundaries and then carefully observing what happens in response. Not dramatic declarations or relationship-ending confrontations that blow up the entire dynamic, but strategic micro-adjustments to your behavior. The next time this person contacts you in crisis mode, instead of dropping everything immediately and making yourself instantly available as you historically have, you deliberately wait. You respond when it's genuinely convenient for you, when you actually have space and energy, not when they demand it through urgency or implied obligation. Observe carefully what happens. Do they escalate? Do they respect the delay without comment? Do they punish you for it? When you do engage, instead of automatically offering solutions or trying to fix their problem as you normally would, you practice simply reflecting back what they're saying without taking any responsibility for resolving it. That sounds really difficult and frustrating. What do you think you'll do about it? This seemingly small shift from absorbing and managing their distress to simply witnessing it without merging with it or taking it on often reveals the actual structure and purpose of the dynamic with startling clarity. If the person was genuinely seeking connection, perspective, or collaborative problem-solving, they'll engage meaningfully with your question. They'll think about it, consider options, take some responsibility. If they're fundamentally seeking regulation that they can't provide for themselves, they'll feel frustrated and possibly angry that you're not performing the function they needed. They might push harder for advice or express irritation at your lack of helpfulness, or disengage entirely and seek someone else who will give them what they want. All of those responses are valuable diagnostic information. They show you what the relationship is actually structured around and maintained by, which might be substantially different than what you consciously believed or hoped it was. The third dimension of practical intervention involves creating deliberate physical and temporal boundaries around interactions with people who consistently drain you. If certain people reliably leave you feeling depleted, you consciously and strategically limit your exposure to them. This doesn't necessarily mean cutting them out of your life entirely, though sometimes that becomes necessary. Often it means controlling the context and duration of interactions much more carefully than you have been. You meet them in public spaces with natural endpoints rather than inviting them into your home for open-ended time. You set explicit time limits in advance. I can meet for 30 minutes, or I have until 3 o'clock, and then you hold those limits firmly, even if the person isn't finished with their emotional download when time runs out. You stop being automatically available for endless text exchanges or late-night phone calls framed as emergencies that turn out to be the same recurring issues you've discussed countless times before. This feels harsh and unkind if you've been deeply conditioned to believe that genuine love and care require unlimited availability regardless of cost to yourself. But unlimited availability isn't sustainable for any human being, and relationships that genuinely require it in order to function aren't actually relationships in any healthy sense. They're extraction operations. Genuinely healthy relationships can tolerate and even require limits. They bend and adapt around the reality that both people have finite resources and legitimate needs. Energy vampiric relationships collapse or become hostile when limits are imposed because the entire structure depends fundamentally on one person's willingness to be endlessly depleted. Imposing limits forces the vampire to either develop their own regulatory capacity, seek professional help, or find another source for what they need. None of those outcomes are your responsibility to manage or prevent. The fourth practice involves cultivating what might be called energetic discernment, which sounds abstract but is actually quite concrete. This means developing refined sensitivity to the subtle behavioral and energetic cues that signal when someone is approaching you as a resource to be extracted rather than as a full person to be related with. It's visible in the quality of attention they bring to interactions. Are they genuinely curious about you and your inner experience, or are they just waiting impatiently for their turn to talk? Do they actually track and respond to what you say, or do your words just bounce off them while they're already formulating their next statement? Do they modulate their demands and requests based on what you can realistically give, or do they expect you to stretch and accommodate regardless of your actual capacity or the cost to your well-being? This kind of discernment develops gradually through repeated, sustained attention to your own internal state during interactions. The body reliably knows before the conscious mind catches up. There's tightness in the chest, fatigue that wasn't present 5 minutes ago, the impulse to escape or avoid, a feeling of being trapped, cornered, or obligated, a sense that you're being pulled away from yourself rather than met where you actually are. These somatic sensations are profoundly diagnostic. They're telling you through the wisdom of your nervous system that something in this exchange isn't reciprocal, that you're giving substantially more than is sustainable, that the other person is taking without awareness of or concern for the cost. Learning to trust those signals, to allow them to inform your choices and boundaries rather than habitually overriding them with internalized shoulds and obligations, is fundamentally how you stop unconsciously volunteering for depletion. What gradually emerges from this, these practices, if they're sustained consistently over time, despite discomfort and resistance both internal and external, is a much clearer differentiation between relationships that genuinely nourish you and relationships that primarily extract from you. Not every relationship needs to be actively nourishing all the time. Some are appropriately neutral. Some are essentially transactional, and that's fine. Some are difficult or demanding, but still fundamentally important and worth the cost. But relationships that consistently, predictably leave you feeling worse than you did before the interaction, that require you to systematically abandon yourself and your own needs in order to maintain them, that actively penalize authenticity and demand endless performance of a self that isn't real, those relationships aren't worth the cost they exact. And recognizing that clearly isn't selfish or immature. It's structural honesty about reality. It's acknowledging that you're not an infinite resource, that your energy and attention and care are genuinely finite and genuinely valuable, and that how you choose to allocate them matters profoundly for the quality and sustainability of your own life. The energy vampire will tell you, either directly or through sophisticated guilt manipulation, that you're being cruel or heartless by withdrawing your previously unlimited availability. But actual cruelty would be continuing indefinitely to enable a dynamic that prevents both people from developing and growing. The vampire needs to develop self-regulation, and as long as you're willing to regulate for them, they have zero incentive to do that difficult developmental work. You need to develop genuine self-protection and healthy self-prioritization, and as long as you're habitually giving yourself away to whoever demands it, you can't build those essential capacities. Ending the dynamic entirely or radically restructuring it into something more balanced ultimately serves both people, even if it doesn't feel that way initially, and even if the vampire experiences it as abandonment or betrayal. The paradox embedded in that initial scenario, the exhaustion that mysteriously appears after giving time and energy to someone who appeared to genuinely need help, resolves when you understand that not all helping is actually helpful, and not all giving actually serves anyone. Some helping is just enabling dysfunction. Some generosity is just disguised self-abandonment. The person who walked away drained wasn't drained simply because they gave their time and attention. They were drained because they gave without appropriate boundaries, without any reciprocity, with adequate regard for their own limits and needs. And they continued giving well past the point where it was sustainable or healthy because they had confused self-sacrifice with virtue, depletion with love. But virtue isn't depletion. Psychological health isn't martyrdom. Real care, the kind that actually serves both people in a relationship over time, necessarily includes limits. It includes honoring your own needs with the same respect you extend to others' needs. It includes recognizing when someone is asking you to do for them what they actually need to learn to do for themselves. And it includes the willingness to disappoint, to be temporarily misunderstood, to be called selfish or unkind by people who benefited from your previous lack of boundaries and don't want that to change. Protecting your energy isn't about becoming cold, withholding, or relationally unavailable. It's about becoming honest, about learning to live from a place where your presence in someone's life is a genuine choice rather than an obligation enforced through guilt, where your care is real because it's given freely from surplus rather than extracted through manipulation, and where the people in your life know you as you actually are, with your real limits and needs, not as the inexhaustible resource they needed you to be to avoid their own growth. That shift doesn't make relationships easier or more comfortable, but it makes them real. And real, even when it's difficult and imperfect, is vastly preferable to the hollow performance of connection that leaves everyone depleted and no one actually seen or known.